Okay, before we get into this, I just have to point out that the Star Wars canon is very complex, and in a lot of cases, it kind of contradicts itself. Or that's not really fair. It just there's a lot of differences based on who the writer is, what kind of themes they're going for, what they're trying to portray. And there's nothing wrong with that. Just if people are saying, well, there's this exception and this happened and this happened, I know that, and I'm probably ignoring things, but I'm just trying to create my perception of. I'm trying to portray a perception of how I view the character. That's how I do with a lot of these. I'll sometimes make leaps of logic. I'll sometimes kind of infer certain things from it in order to kind of make it a more coherent story. And we're going to have to do a lot of that with Palpatine because every iteration of him is often quite different, but there's certain similarities. So, that being said, let's get into it. I think the thing you have to really grasp with Palpatine, in contrast to a lot of other Sith Lords, is that absolutely nothing mattered to him beyond himself. He was in a lot of ways kind of the ultimate sociopath. He had no affection for any other people, no affection for things, no real emotions. All that mattered to him was his own self-interest. And his own self-interest could be a very mercurial thing. Once he set his mind on something, he'd do anything to obtain it, and he had no qualms of destroying absolutely anyone who got in his path. But I say this, and you may be saying, but aren't most Sith like that? And to a large extent, that's true. All Sith desire power. All Sith do similar actions to Palpatine. Generally speaking, though, among the Sith, there is still a commitment to higher principles. During the Rule of Two era, the masters and apprentices expected that the apprentice would eventually kill the masters, and the masters accepted that. And while they would fight for their lives, they went to their own deaths happy, knowing that they were continuing the Rule of Two, and they were going to bring about the extinction of the Jedi. When Darth Plagueis kills Darth Tenebrae is pleased that his apprentice managed to surpass him. That was even a concern Darth Bane had, that his apprentice would not be able to surpass him and he would have to find someone stronger. Palpatine, to a large extent, didn't really care about this. When he finally got his apprentices, he would kind of throw them away one after another. And I don't really believe he had any intent for any of them to ever succeed him. And to that end, he really had no loyalty whatsoever to the Sith Order. All he cared about was what the Sith could bring to him. And even in kind of like, if you look at the game The Old Republic, while the Sith are all psychotic and self-serving, etc., there is some genuine loyalty to the Empire, even if not to the idea of the Empire, to the idea of having an order of Sith Lords, even if they're all personally treacherous. And I think Palpatine didn't even feel that minimal loyalty. I mean, you have a lot of different Sith. You have Sith like Darth Krayt, who is definitely a bad person, but has a very strong sense of something greater than himself. Then you kind of have Sith like Darth Nihilus, who are just basically they're mindless abominations that just destroy everything in their path. And then you have men like Palpatine, who are kind of empty but are also extremely intelligent, and they're probably the most dangerous form of person possible. So to understand Palpatine, we kind of have to go back to his youth. Now, why he's called Palpatine is his actual name, which I believe is Shiv, something like that. Palpatine. He stopped going by his name very early in his life, which is why no one ever uses it. So he was born into a royal family on Naboo. Naboo was a very conservative, traditional, I wouldn't say backwater exactly. It was kind of a not particularly wealthy but quite pleasant world. Naboo was quite rural. It had this kind of interesting, what would you call it, archaeo-futuristic. It had kind of a very old world charm, but also being very kind of advanced and in the future. It was kind of a garden world. And Naboo had just recently started to kind of come in contact with the rest of the galaxy. There were various factions on the world. There were factions that thought Naboo should become more active in the Republic, that Naboo should embrace multiculturalism, that Naboo should kind of be forward-looking and progressive. And there was a group of traditionalists who believed that Naboo was fine as it was. They advocated minimal trade, building up Naboo's own forces and maintaining its, I guess, kind of Naboo-ness. They didn't like multiculturalism. They didn't like foreign governments, and they didn't like being at the mercy of intergalactic corporations. Palpatine's father was a conservative. He was also a sadistic, ruthless man, and Palpatine and him despised each other from when they were very young. Palpatine, being a sociopath, was expelled from school after doing a number of disturbing things to various students, and each time his father would bail him out. Naboo was an elective monarchy where the great families would elect one of their own to be the king of or queen of Naboo for a set term. In Palpatine's case, he was from one of the royal families, but his family had not been king for a long time. Had not been kings for a long time, and he despised his father's seeming lack of ambition. His father was satisfied with what he had, albeit in a very arrogant way. It was not kind of you have people who are satisfied with what they have, but they're happy with it. His father was a bitter and irritable man. So what wound up happening was his father, to try to bribe him into behaving, bought Palpatine an extremely expensive speeder, and Palpatine killed two pedestrians with it, and his father bailed him out of that. And then Palpatine expressed absolutely no remorse towards it, but a lifetime of his father bailing him out made him realize that there were no consequences for any of his actions. And that kind of removed a lot of the fears of self-preservation. Because a lot of time, even if you don't have a moral compass, you understand that people around you do, and if you go too far, then other people are going to try and kill you. But Palpatine kind of lost that fear of other people as a result of his father's actions and there being no consequences. Palpatine also saw that there was no real justice in the universe because he could do whatever he wanted. He could even kill people and no one would care. So Palpatine never considered himself to be evil. He thought that morality didn't exist, that evil was a term that was placed on people who were exceptional. And we kind of get to this, and most of this is from the novel Darth Plagueis, which it recounts most of Palpatine's life, even though he's obviously not the main character. But Palpatine, I think let's get into kind of his ideology here, because this is kind of when he starts to enter the scene in the novel Darth Plagueis. We start to kind of see the beginnings of his political philosophy. Palpatine, I think, is first and foremost, you have to understand him as one of the more accurate portrayals of fascism in fiction. And I don't mean like Voldemort's lame, like, oh, he's like a evil racist. Kind of one of the issues in fiction is what I like to call contrived evil. Contrived evil is where people aren't evil as a result of their ideology. They're not evil as a result of their beliefs or who they are. They're evil because they do evil things. Like, Voldemort's ideology wouldn't necessarily make him like a mass murdering psychopath, but he's the villain because he's just fucking crazy. And he does stuff that has nothing to do with his ideology, like just torturing random people to death. But he's the bad guy and his ideas are bad by association, or he just holds ideas that people don't like in our society, and they're stuck on him to make him more evil or for political reasons. So when I talk about Palpatine being a fascist, I mean that in kind of the literal sense. Fascism is often called reactionary modernism, and there's a reason for that. It combines a lot of admittedly reactionary ideas, male power, domination, hierarchy, xenophobia. I use that term unironically. Kind of a lot of those things, grandeur, rejection of equality with a belief in progress, kind of progressivism. Palpatine in Darth Plagueis describes himself as a progressive. He despises the conservative establishment of Naboo. He wants Naboo to join the wider galaxy. He wants it to become more multicultural. He doesn't mind about the planet being sold out to intergalactic banking. He opposes Naboo trying to develop its own armed forces because he doesn't think that he just doesn't like it. He despises the art on Naboo. Naboo has very older, like I said, archaeofuturism. He despises it. The only form of art Palpatine likes is minimalism and abstract art because he sees it as a progressive aesthetic which crushes a decadent past. Since Palpatine has no kind of feelings towards anything, he has no attachment towards the past. Instead, he is a very future-oriented individual. Psychologically, we might see this as it being a result of him being so completely and utterly self-absorbed, because change is something that he can create. When he creates the Empire, that's something built by him. The past is something that somebody else built. And he doesn't like it for that reason. Or at least that's kind of one of my thoughts on the matter. But no, he despised the Republic. He saw it as old, weak, decadent, traditional. He saw it as a lot of people just ruled by emotion. The ideas of freedom, democracy, decentralization, respecting each individual planet's culture. All of these things he just saw as being emotionalism. He saw them as being old-fashioned and just bad. At the same time, though, Palpatine was deeply xenophobic. When Darth Plagueis attempted to approach him, he attempted to avoid him because he doesn't like aliens. And disliking aliens would be something that would go with Palpatine for the rest of his life, even though he would hide it. Now, people have different views. Some people say because his second in command was an alien that he was not anti-alien. I don't know. I think some people say he was not xenophobic. He just played upon the dominant xenophobia among humans at the time. I don't know. I think that's kind of seems like a cop-out. It's trying to make Palpatine into a transcendent evil and someone who is not at all influenced by the prejudices or the ideas of his time. So I personally think that Palpatine was a human supremacist, maybe less than a lot of people around him. He was certainly willing to overlook human supremacism if it was in his best interest. But the Empire, I think, very obviously has a human and near-human, to a lesser extent, ideology. What's very clear, though, is Palpatine believed in patriarchy. He didn't like women. He despised them in general. I mean, there were women like, what's her name? Yvonne Isard. Yvonne? I can't pronounce her first name. I'm not sure. Star Wars names are weird. But there's her and there were some other people. But by and large, the Empire was ruled by human males. They even call it human supremacy. It's really one of the only patriarchal organizations in Star Wars. Although the old Sith Empire was more patriarchal than the Republic was, and it was also human-centric. And that kind of lends me some more credence to the idea that Palpatine was xenophobic, because that's fairly common among the Sith. It became less so under Bane, because Bane believed that all that mattered was talent and potential. But even so, most of the Sith were still human. The old Sith empires had specific anti-alien policies in place. Although the old Sith are weird because a lot of them are hybrids. So like pureblood, like Sith, the species, and humans were both privileged groups, but all others were viewed as bad, which is kind of interesting. But regardless. So yes, I do think that Palpatine was xenophobic. And this is kind of an interesting thing to kind of mix with his progressivism. Because as we know, racism as we know it today originally came out of progressivism. And I don't say that as a Dems or the real racist thing. I say that's just kind of a fact, because Darwin, Galton, a lot of these early people basically took, as soon as we started having genetic theories and stuff, they started to take the view of scientism. That is, morals don't exist, spirit doesn't exist. All that exists is kind of physical facts. And while Palpatine doesn't exactly believe in that, his kind of progressive view, I think, would kind of tend to that direction. The Young Turks in Turkey said, okay, we have to build a modern state, and part of building a modern state is an acknowledgement of race. And when we're going to do that, we're going to exterminate the minorities. So I could see there being an aspect of scientific racism or scientific xenophobia, which is completely compatible with Palpatine's worldview. If anything, being a progressive makes it more so, because unlike kind of the what's the term, parochial men on his home planet who just didn't want aliens on their planet, his view was universal. He didn't want aliens anywhere in the galaxy. So you kind of have the grandiosity of progressivism with kind of Palpatine's own kind of feelings on the matter, and you kind of have these two things coming together within the Empire. So that's why I say he's kind of a good example of fascism, because he is pretty much an even blend of progressivism and kind of some reactionary ideas. The Empire was minimalist, but it also invoked grandeur. It attempted to collectivize the galaxy into a single blended culture, but at the same time it was very patriotic and nationalistic. So there's a lot of different things. Kind of other aspects are Palpatine's empire was a one-party state. You had the Commission for the Preservation of the New Order, which is kind of like the SA and the Nazi Party. And basically it was an organization mainly for human males that provided political training, and they had their own kind of political police force and that sort of thing. And propaganda was all throughout the empire. Much like a fascist regime, they did not impose a command economy, but they nationalized a lot of corporations. They controlled a lot of them through bribery or intimidation, etc. And you kind of have this strange, I guess, kind of state capitalist economy that they succeeded in building. You also had a preference for expensive, over-the-top grand projects, as can be seen with Palpatine's various super weapons. I think, though, that getting back to the original theme, we've kind of gone through Palpatine's ideology a bit. What Palpatine believed was that he was the end of the rule of two. He had no allegiance to the Sith Order. He had no allegiance to any sort of grander plan aside from his own power and his own supremacy. And he also believed that there was good to be done for the universe. He was the man to do it. He was the sole person who was able to provide the enlightened, progressive, strong leadership that could unite the galaxy. And the entire empire is built as a system that can only be run by him. I'll get into that in a second. And he intended to live forever, so it made sense that it was only built to be run by him. When I put it out, or if this goes out first or whatever, there is a video I'm going to do on Star Wars governments, and I go into this in more detail. But basically, Palpatine's government is set up so it can only be run by him. In a lot of ways, it's more decentralized, yet more centralized than the Old Republic was. In the Old Republic, pretty much every planet or system had its own government. They might have a tiny home guard, but they didn't really have a military. A Moff controls a huge sector of space and has a large military of their own. Grand Moffs have an even bigger sector of space and contain entire navies. You have all these huge military forces with a very decentralized command structure. While Palpatine had absolute power, the vast majority of administration no longer took place on Coruscant. Instead, it just took place by the various governors throughout the galaxy. And even though he had absolute power in a lot of ways, it was less centralized than it had been under the Republic. The problem was this depended upon someone who is universally feared, someone who could play the various political actors off against each other and could, through his immense personal charisma and personal abilities, keep them in line. What wound up happening was when Palpatine died, all these ambitious men with all these armies immediately started destroying one another. If it had have, I guess, kind of retained more kind of a Republic era, no one would have had an army. They might have had armies to defend their own systems, and that's fine, but the Moffs had such huge forces that they could conquer star systems. They could launch their own campaigns. And after Palpatine died, you had thousands of people with thousands of fleets. There's also the issue that there was no system of succession, nor had Palpatine ever really, I think, discussed it. He didn't want to get married. He didn't really like women. I don't think there's any evidence that Palpatine was gay, but I do often find with Sith there's a kind of asexuality to them, that they've just become so dedicated to the dark side. They almost kind of view sex and kind of attraction to women or whatever as being a weakness, which is interesting because one of their things is there is no passion, there is only strength. And no, there is no peace, there is passion or whatever it is. And yet at the same time, so you have that, but at the same time you also have kind of a disdain for attachment as much as the Jedi. So he didn't really intend to have a child. There was no succession plan in place. I don't think Vader was ever officially his heir. He was never able to really find an apprentice that he thought was worthy to succeed him. And so he kept keeping Vader around, even though he didn't really think Vader was strong enough. So people think that if Vader had been strong enough to overthrow him, his plan was to have him become the next emperor. Other people say that Palpatine simply intended to... So you have recipes for disaster. You have this strange mixture of extreme centralization and extreme decentralization. You have a cult of personality. You have an ideology that's largely based on the rule of one man and no clear system of succession. So in a lot of ways it is like a fascist government. A lot of fascist governments didn't really have real succession plans in place, because they tended to be based on the charisma of one individual, and if they were gone, then the state would kind of end with them, which is kind of... I mean, it's difficult to know what would have happened to Nazi Germany if they had have won the war and Hitler would have died. I think things would have changed a lot, and I think in Italy things might have changed a lot. When Franco died, his regime died shortly after him, as did Salazar. And I don't know, that's kind of my intuition, because it's not a monarchy, so it doesn't have a plan of succession. And generally speaking, the leadership is unwilling to pick someone to be their successor. And even though Franco did, his successor kind of undid it. So that's kind of my point. What I'm kind of getting back to is that's the theme of Palpatine's life, I think, pulling everything together. He built an empire in which only he could control and only he could rule, because he believed he was the only person who could bring progress and order to the galaxy. It was the result of his supreme egoism to create a state that only he could run. And the second that he was gone, the whole thing fell apart, and the galaxy would have decades of civil war and turmoil. If you want to consider it canon, he had a plan for immortality in his cloned bodies. But when he came back, I don't know if it was mental degeneration or whatever, but he just did a really bad job. Ultimately, I think what undermined Palpatine and led to his destruction was his overwhelming arrogance. They say there's something called victory sickness, or victory disease, which is what happens when you win too often. Winning too often can be just as bad as winning too little. This is what happened with the Japanese after they won the Russo-Japanese War. They beat Russia, they beat a great power, they were an Asian power, they smashed Russia utterly. And because they were able to do that, they said, we can win anything now. We can take on any Western power and win. And this led them in part to challenge Holland, Britain, America, and all these other major powers. And that overconfidence led to their downfall. And in Palpatine's case, overconfidence really led to his downfall because he had won. He beat the Jedi when no one else could. He killed his master, one of the greatest Sith Lords of all time. He destroyed a republic that had lasted 25,000 years. He had done things that no one had come close to doing, and probably no one would ever come close to again. He was the most powerful Sith in history. But because of all of this, it massaged his ego. It fulfilled his wildest delusions about how powerful he was and how great he was. He believed himself to be the dark side. And pride comes before the fall, as it was. Despite Palpatine's immense power, and despite his quest for immortality and the super state he constructed, ultimately he was a victim of his own success, and his gambit over Endor was an unnecessary risk. He also, believing that Vader could never betray him, turned his back to Vader while killing his son in front of him. He still thought of Vader as the whipped dog that he had built when he was younger. He said, I've built Vader to be a monster, and I think he called him a minor masterpiece or something to that effect in one of the books he wrote. But ultimately, I think Palpatine's death is due to a couple different issues, all of which kind of stem from his arrogance. The first one is, I think once he became emperor, he stopped practicing. There's a group of, in the Twilight books, there's the Romanian Coven, and they were worshipped as kings and ruled the Romanian Empire. As kind of as an arrogant sign of how powerful they would take to sitting on thrones for decades at a time, and their bodies would literally decay and fall apart despite their immortality. I kind of see Palpatine as being similar. He didn't practice with a lightsaber anymore. He didn't really practice with his force powers or think about fighting anybody, because he saw it in his arrogance. He figured that stuff was all behind him. So his powers had dimmed. Second, he was using battle meditation to support his fleet, which was probably useful but not a good idea when you're in the middle of a really heated lightsaber battle. 3, I don't think he thought Vader would ever betray him. 4, I think he thought Luke would join him because he'd always been successful at pretty much anything he'd ever done. And so what wound up happening was, because he was distracted by battle meditation, and because he was distracted by battle meditation, and by his having fun at torturing yet another of his enemies, he just didn't see Vader coming, and he couldn't figure out how to react because he was just shocked that Vader had betrayed him. Force user or not, if your pawn for the last 30 years, who you basically raised as a son, suddenly turns on you and attacks you in an instant, it's going to be pretty shocking, especially when you're in the middle of torturing someone and coordinating the entirety of a battle fleet using your mind. But Palpatine put himself in an unnecessary risk. There was no reason he had to be on Endor. There's no reason he had to be at the second Death Star. It was just all arrogance. It was all just him having had his own way for so long, and ironically enough, achieving what he wanted, of building one empire with one ruler that could only be him. And because of that, as soon as he died, his life's work completely unraveled. And from wherever hell he's in, he has to watch his once mighty empire disintegrate into nothingness. Not even remembered fondly in the way that the Old Republic was. So that's my character profile of Palpatine. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I'll talk to you guys later.